The alarm hit before I could finish my coffee. Not the standard proximity warning we ran drills for, not the asteroid deflection tone I had memorized during 6 years aboard the orbital platform Iron Veil. This was something else entirely. Every screen on the command deck turned red at the same time, and a sound I had never heard in my life filled the station. It was the sound of every sensor we owned screaming in unison. I dropped the coffee. It floated in a slow spiral away from me as I grabbed the edge of my console and pulled myself into my chair. My name is Dara Kessler, and at that moment, I was the senior watch officer on humanity's outermost orbital defense platform, a station built to track space debris and nudge the occasional wayward rock away from populated zones. I was not prepared for what appeared on my screens. Thousands of contacts, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. They materialized out of nothing, folding into real space, in a cascading wave that started beyond the moon's orbit and spread inward like a net closing around a fish. Each contact was large, each contact was armed, and every single one of them was pointed at Earth. Kessler, what am I looking at? That was Lieutenant Greg Harmon at the sensor station, his voice already climbing toward panic. Get me identification on those signatures, I said. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. Training does that. It holds you together for the first few minutes, and after that, you either find your nerve or you don't. The identification came back in fragments. The computer didn't recognize the energy profiles because it had never been programmed to. These were not human vessels. These were not anything in our database. But the computer did recognize one thing about them. The energy readings coming off their forward arrays matched the theoretical signature of directed plasma discharge at weapons-grade density. They were warships, and they were charging their guns. Get me CENTCOM, I said. Get me anyone on the ground. Now. Greg tried. For 11 seconds he tried. Then the first volley hit. I didn't see it as individual shots. The entire space between the alien fleet and Earth lit up in a wall of blue-white fire that swept across my viewport like a curtain being drawn. The shots were aimed at the surface, and I watched in frozen silence as they punched through the atmosphere and struck. Mumbai. I saw Mumbai light up from orbit, then Lagos, then Sao Paulo. 3 flashes, 3 cities, 3 populations measured in the tens of millions, and the light from the impacts was bright enough to make the viewport darken automatically to protect my eyes. No, Greg whispered beside me. It wasn't a useful thing to say. It was the only honest thing. The second volley was aimed at us. Not at Iron Veil specifically, but at everything in orbit. Our sister station Redoubt 7, positioned over the Atlantic, took a direct hit and came apart in a silent explosion that scattered debris across 3 orbital lanes. I saw it happen. I knew the crew. I had played cards with their watch commander 2 weeks ago. I didn't have time to mourn. The debris cloud was already spreading, and a second hit took out Redoubt 3 over the Pacific. That left me 1 station out of 4, with a sensor suite designed for tracking rocks, and a weapons package that consisted of 6 kinetic interceptors meant for asteroids. I was alone in orbit with 1,000 alien warships between me and the planet I was supposed to protect. Helm, get us behind the moon. Right now, maximum thrust. Commander, if we move to lunar shadow, we lose line of sight to the surface. If we stay here, we lose everything. Move. Iron Veil's engines fired. They were not fast engines. They were not built for evasion. The station groaned around me as we began the slow burn toward the moon's shadow, and I watched the alien fleet through the aft sensors as we pulled away. They weren't chasing us. We were too small to bother with. They had bigger targets. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes. I counted every one of those minutes because I had nothing else to do during the transit except watch my planet burn and listen to the communications channels fill with chaos. Ground-based military frequencies were a wall of overlapping voices, frantic, professional, terrified. Air defense networks were activating across every continent, but they had been designed to fight other humans. The weapons being fired at them from orbit operated on principles our physicists hadn't finished theorizing about yet. I kept the external cameras running, because someone had to record this. Someone had to make sure there was a record of what was happening, even if no one survived to watch it. The alien fleet moved with the precision of a machine, each ship firing in sequence, each volley targeting a different population center. They were methodical about it. There was no passion in their attack, no fury, no hatred. They destroyed cities the way an exterminator clears a building, room by room, floor by floor, thorough and indifferent. The death toll was climbing in real time on my displays. Our ground-based tracking systems were still feeding casualty projections to anyone who could receive them, and the numbers scrolled past in a continuous stream that my mind refused to process as actual human lives. 10 million, 20 million, 40 million. Each number was a city gone dark, a hospital vaporized, a neighborhood reduced to glass and cinder. I forced myself to watch. I owed the dead that much. I did catch fragments of hope amid the chaos. CENTCOM was still operational, buried deep under a mountain, somewhere in the American Rockies. European Command was active. The Chinese Integrated Defense Network was online, and had actually scored a hit on a low-flying alien vessel with a surface-to-orbit missile, which gave me a sharp spike of desperate hope before I realized that one hit against 1,000 ships meant nothing. The Japanese Navy had deployed every submarine in its fleet to deep water, and the Russian Strategic Command had gone to full alert, though what good ground-based missiles would do against orbital warships was a question nobody wanted to answer out loud. Then I caught something else. A signal on a frequency I didn't recognize, broadcast from a source I couldn't identify, using an encryption scheme that my computer flagged as unknown. But it wasn't alien. The carrier wave was human. Someone on Earth was talking to someone else, using equipment that didn't officially exist. I was still trying to decode it when Greg called out from the sensor station. "Commander, I'm picking up a transmission from the alien fleet. Broad spectrum, unencrypted. It's in about 40 different languages, none of them human." "What's it say?" "I'm running it through the linguistic analysis package. It's going to take a minute." It took 4 minutes. When the translation came through, I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. The message was not addressed to humanity. It was addressed to something called the Galactic Council, a governing body representing over 300 sentient species. The message was a formal notification from an entity called the Vedrathi Dominion, informing the Council that a pacification campaign had been initiated against an uncontacted pre-tier species occupying the 3rd planet of the Sol system. The message characterized the operation as a routine territorial acquisition and assured the Council that the matter would be resolved within a standard cycle. They were telling the rest of the galaxy that they were wiping us out, and they were doing it with the casual tone of someone filing a permit application. I pulled up the intercepted Council response. Multiple species had replied. Most acknowledged the notification without comment. A few expressed mild concern about the lack of prior diplomatic contact. One species, identified as the Lorathi, formally requested that the Vedrathi minimize unnecessary suffering where operationally feasible. Another species, the Vanteri, requested that the Vedrathi preserve any biological samples of scientific interest before the operation concluded, as if we were a collection of insects being cleared from a garden. That was it. That was the galaxy's response to the attempted extinction of the human race. A polite suggestion to keep it tidy, and a request to bag some specimens. 300 species knew we existed. 300 species watched us burn. Not one of them said stop. I sat in the command chair behind the moon's shadow, and felt something cold settle into my chest. It wasn't fear. I had been afraid when the first volley hit, and I had been afraid when Redoubt 7 exploded, and I had been afraid during the transit. But this was different. This was the feeling of understanding something fundamental about the universe for the first time. We were alone. We had always been alone, and the things in the dark didn't care if we lived or died. The encrypted human signal I had detected earlier suddenly resolved on my screen. My computer shouldn't have been able to crack it, but someone on the other end apparently decided to let me in, because the decryption key arrived in a separate burst transmission tagged with CENTCOM's authentication codes. The message was 2 words long. Lazarus Live. I didn't know what Protocol Lazarus was. My security clearance covered orbital defense operations, satellite networks, and debris tracking. Whatever Lazarus was, it lived in the parts of the military infrastructure that people like me weren't told about. But I knew what the word meant. Lazarus. The dead man who got back up. 20 minutes later, I received a direct communication from a voice I didn't recognize, using a rank I didn't know existed. The voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having prepared for the worst day in human history and finding out that your preparations were about to be tested. Commander Kessler, this is Black Ridge Actual. You are hereby reassigned to Protocol Lazarus Operational Command. Your station's sensor suite and communications array are now classified assets. You will maintain position in lunar shadow and await further instructions. Do not attempt to contact standard military channels. Do not reveal your position. As of this moment, you are the only orbital asset we have left, and we are going to need you. Understood, I said, because that was what you said. Can you tell me what Lazarus is? There was a pause. When the voice came back, it carried something I hadn't expected. Not despair, not anger, anticipation. Lazarus is what we built while we were smiling at the stars, Commander. And it is time to stop smiling. The channel closed. I sat in the dark behind the moon and looked at my screens. The bombardment had slowed. The alien fleet was repositioning into occupation formations, spreading out to cover the planet, preparing to land ground forces. They thought the hard part was over. They thought they had broken us. I looked at the night side of Earth, where fires traced the outlines of entire coastlines, where hundreds of millions of people were dead or dying, where the greatest catastrophe in the history of our species was still unfolding in real time, and I felt that cold thing in my chest change shape. It wasn't ice anymore, it was iron. Somewhere down there, in the burning dark, underneath mountains and oceans, and 17 years of secrets, something was waking up, and the galaxy was not going to like what it saw when it opened its eyes. 72 hours after the first shot was fired, the Vidrathi Dominion transmitted a second report to the Galactic Council. I intercepted it from my position behind the moon, where I had spent 3 days surviving on emergency rations and recycled air while monitoring every signal that crossed the solar system. The report was brief and confident. Organized human resistance, it said, had been functionally neutralized. Ground forces were establishing control zones across all major continents. The surviving population was expected to submit within one standard cycle. I read that report and laughed. It was the first sound I had made in hours that wasn't an order or a systems check, and it startled Greg so badly he banged his head on his console. I didn't explain why I was laughing. I just pointed at my secondary screen, where something extraordinary was happening. Transmissions were coming up from Earth, not the scattered, desperate military chatter I had been monitoring since the attack. These were different, clean, encrypted in formats my computer had never encountered despite being loaded with every cipher system in the combined military inventory of 6 nations. These transmissions were organized, layered, and moving, with a coordination that suggested a command structure I hadn't known existed. I watched the signals multiply. They came from underground, from under the oceans, from locations that didn't appear on any map I had access to. Within 6 hours of the Vidrathi declaring victory, I counted over 400 separate transmission sources active across the planet, all communicating on frequencies that the alien occupation force couldn't detect because they didn't know to look for them. Then the submarines surfaced. I picked them up on thermal imaging first. 7 vessels, rising from the deep Pacific in a formation that spread across 200 kilometers of ocean. They were not standard naval submarines. They were too large, their heat signatures were wrong, and when they opened their dorsal launch arrays, my sensors registered energy readings that matched nothing in any human weapons database I had ever seen. "Commander," Greg said slowly, staring at his screen, "those submarines just launched something. 47 objects, moving at velocities I cannot explain with any propulsion system I know of. The objects climbed out of the atmosphere in less than 90 seconds. They reached orbit and immediately scattered, each one heading for a different Vidrathi vessel. The Vidrathi point defense systems didn't react. They didn't react because the objects were too small and too fast, and were emitting absolutely no electromagnetic signature at all. They were invisible. The Vidrathi sensors, which could track a comet at 10 light minutes, and calculate the mass of an asteroid from its gravitational influence, could not see something the size of a human fist moving at 4% of light speed directly toward their hulls. 12 Vedrathi ships died in the next 3 minutes. They didn't explode dramatically. They just stopped. Their power systems went dark, their engines cut out, and they began to drift. When I magnified the image on one of them, I could see the hull breach. Perfectly circular, maybe 2 meters across, punched clean through the ship from one side to the other, as if someone had driven a needle through a soap bubble. The entry wound was neat. The exit wound was a flower of shredded metal, peeled outward by the kinetic energy of an object that had transferred enough force on impact to exceed the structural tolerance of materials designed to withstand micrometeorite bombardment. I stared at the screen and tried to understand what I was seeing. Humanity had weapons that could do that. Humanity had weapons that could do that. And I, a senior orbital defense officer with classified clearance, had never heard of them. The encrypted channel from Black Ridge Actual opened again. The same calm voice, but this time, there was something underneath the calm that sounded almost like satisfaction. Commander Kessler, welcome to the real war. What you are witnessing is the activation of Protocol Lazarus Phase 1. I owe you an explanation, and I'm going to give you one. Because in about 40 minutes, you're going to be asked to do things that won't make sense without context. The explanation changed everything I thought I knew about my own species. In 2029, humanity's first deep space probe detected unmistakable evidence of alien civilizations. Radio signals, energy signatures, the spectral footprint of artificial megastructures around distant stars. The discovery was confirmed by 4 independent space agencies within a week. And then something unprecedented happened. Every major government on Earth agreed, in secret, unanimously, on a single course of action. They told no one. They shared the discovery with no civilian institution, no media outlet, no scientific body. Instead, they began to build. Not for diplomacy, not for communication, not for the optimistic first contact scenarios that science fiction had fed us for a century. They built for the scenario that every honest military strategist knew was statistically most likely. They built for the day something came to kill us. 17 years. 17 years of black-budget weapons development spread across hidden facilities on every continent. 17 years of shipyard construction in hollowed-out asteroids and inside the permanently shadowed craters of the moon. 17 years of materials science breakthroughs that were classified before the ink on the research papers was dry. 17 years of the entire human species walking around under an open sky, not knowing that their governments had looked into the dark between the stars and seen teeth. Protocol Lazarus was the activation code for all of it. The weapons you just saw deployed, Black Ridge Actual told me, are called penetrators. They are kinetic kill vehicles accelerated to 4% of light speed, using magnetic launch systems that we buried under the Pacific seabed. Each one carries no warhead. At that velocity, they don't need one. They are the simplest weapons we built. Commander, they are nowhere near the most dangerous. I processed that information while watching the Vedrathi fleet scramble. They were trying to understand what had just killed 12 of their ships. Their communications, which I had been monitoring since the first day, shifted from confident occupation chatter to something I recognized from my own military training. Confusion. The beginning stages of an enemy realizing they had miscalculated. On the ground, the situation was changing even faster. The Vedrathi had landed ground forces across every major continent, expecting to encounter a shattered population with no organized resistance. What they found instead was something that would eventually be studied in military academies across 40 star systems. I monitored the ground war through intercepted Vedrathi field reports because they were transmitting in the clear, still too arrogant to encrypt their communications against a species they considered primitive. The reports told a story of mounting bewilderment. In what had been Europe, Vedrathi armored columns advanced into cities and discovered that the buildings were empty. Not abandoned in panic, but systematically evacuated. The civilian population had vanished underground, through tunnel networks that hadn't existed on any surface survey. When the Vedrathi pushed into the tunnels, they found them rigged with traps and defended by soldiers using weapons that should not have been in any human arsenal. In Asia, Vedrathi landing zones were attacked within hours of establishment by coordinated strikes from forces that appeared out of terrain the aliens couldn't navigate. Mountain passes, dense forests, river systems, the parts of Earth's geography that humans had been fighting in for 10,000 years and knew the way a musician knows an instrument. The Vedrathi had superior firepower. The humans had superior knowledge of every rock, every ridge, every shadow. In the Americas, the Vedrathi encountered something worse. The human forces there didn't just fight back, they attacked. Not defensive actions, not guerrilla harassment, but full-scale offensive operations, targeting Vedrathi supply lines, communication nodes, and landing craft. They moved at night, using the darkness that humans had evolved to navigate. They struck, caused catastrophic damage, and disappeared before the Vedrathi could respond. The alien field commanders began reporting that they couldn't find the human forces between engagements. They were simply gone, absorbed back into a landscape that seemed to be actively conspiring against the invaders. In Africa, the situation was even stranger from the Vedrathi perspective. The continent's military forces had dispersed into the interior the moment the bombardment began, abandoning the coastal cities that the Vedrathi had targeted, and melting into geography that ranged from dense jungle to open savanna to desert that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Vedrathi patrol units sent into these environments began reporting equipment failures, sensor malfunctions, and navigation errors that no diagnostic could explain. They didn't understand that the humans were using the land itself as a weapon. Water sources were poisoned with substances harmless to terrestrial life, but corrosive to Vedrathi equipment. Game trails were laced with traps that exploited the invaders' greater body mass, and in the deep desert, where the Vedrathi assumed no opposition could survive, human special operations teams were living in conditions that would have killed any other species in the galaxy, drinking recycled water and eating rations designed for exactly this scenario, waiting for targets of opportunity. One intercepted Vedrathi field report summed it up in a way that I found almost poetic in its bewilderment. The officer wrote that the humans appeared to have a relationship with their planet that went beyond habitation. They used its weather patterns, its terrain features, its biological systems, even its day and night cycles, as integrated components of their military strategy. He concluded that occupying Earth was not like occupying a planet. It was like occupying an organism that was fighting back through its inhabitants. He was not entirely wrong. I intercepted a Galactic Council observer's report during this period. The Lorathi diplomatic mission had positioned a sensor satellite in high Earth orbit to monitor the situation, and their observer was filing updates to the Council in real time. The report I intercepted was marked with a classification I didn't recognize, but the content needed no translation. The observer noted that human casualties from the initial bombardment had exceeded 200 million confirmed dead. She noted that by every behavioral model in the Council's database, a species that suffered casualties of that magnitude would enter a collapse state. Social structures would fragment. Military cohesion would dissolve. The surviving population would seek terms of surrender to prevent further loss. Humanity was doing the opposite. The observer wrote that human resistance was intensifying in direct proportion to casualties. The more humans died, the harder the survivors fought. She used a phrase that I memorized because it captured something true about us that I had never been able to articulate. She wrote that humans appeared to convert grief into operational capability with an efficiency that had no parallel in any species the Council had ever studied. She recommended that the Council begin contingency planning for the possibility that the Vedrathi had made a catastrophic miscalculation. No one on the Council acted on her recommendation. 40 minutes after my briefing from Black Ridge Actual, I received my new orders. Iron Veil was to serve as the command relay for a coordinated orbital counterattack using assets I hadn't known we possessed. Mining drones from the lunar facility had been repurposed overnight, loaded with shaped nuclear charges designed for asteroid fragmentation, and fitted with crude but effective guidance systems cobbled together by engineers who had been building things that exploded for 17 years. My job was targeting. I had the best sensor suite left in orbit, and I knew how to use it. "You're going to paint 3 Vedrathi capital ships for our drone swarm," Blackridge told me. "Choose the ones closest to the flagship. We want the fleet commander to see this personally." I chose my targets. 3 massive vessels, each one larger than anything humanity had ever put into space, each one carrying enough firepower to glass a continent. I locked my sensors onto them and transmitted the targeting data to the drone swarm. The targeting process took 11 seconds. Those 11 seconds were the most focused I had ever been in my life. Every calculation had to be perfect, because we would not get a second chance at this. I factored in orbital drift, the Vedrathi fleet's formation spacing, the gravitational influence of the moon on the drone trajectories, and the rotation rate of each target vessel. When the lock indicator turned green on all 3 targets, I felt my heart rate slow. Not from relaxation, from certainty. The drones came in low over the lunar surface, using the moon's gravity well to accelerate and its mass to mask their approach. There were over 200 of them, and they moved in a swarm pattern that no point defense system was designed to counter, because no species in the galaxy used mining equipment as a delivery system for nuclear weapons. The Vedrathi detected them too late. Their defensive fire took out maybe 30 drones. The rest hit their targets. 3 capital ships, 3 simultaneous nuclear detonations, 3 new stars burning briefly in the darkness above Earth. The explosions were silent in the vacuum, but on the Vedrathi communication channels, I heard the silence that followed, as every alien officer in the fleet tried to process what had just happened. I recorded that silence, 15 seconds of absolute nothing across every channel, every frequency, every command network in the Vedrathi fleet. 15 seconds during which a military force that had conquered dozens of species stood perfectly still and tried to comprehend how a planet they had written off as a graveyard had just reached up and killed 3 of their most powerful warships. When the silence broke, it broke into chaos. Officers shouting for damage reports, sensor teams demanding to know the origin of the attack, fleet coordinators trying to redistribute defensive coverage around the gaps where 3 capital ships had been. And underneath all the noise, a current of something I recognized from a very human place in my understanding. Panic. Not the panic of surprise, but the deeper panic of realizing that your assumptions about the universe were wrong, and that the universe was now going to make you pay for that mistake. Then I heard the fleet commander's voice. He was calling home. He was calling the Vedrathi Dominion and requesting reinforcements. And for the first time since the invasion began, his report did not use the word pacification. He called it a war. I sat behind the moon and watched the debris from 3 dead capital ships drift through space, glowing with residual heat. And I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not going to end with Earth's surrender. This was not going to end with a diplomatic resolution or a council intervention. This was going to end with one side broken beyond recovery, and I had just watched my species announce that it would not be us. The reinforcement fleet arrived 11 days after the first attack, and I watched it fold into real space from my position in the lunar shadow, with a feeling that I can only describe as grim anticipation. 600 additional Vedrathi warships, spread across a formation that stretched from Earth's orbit to beyond the moon. They were fresh, fully armed, and they had come expecting to crush whatever spark of resistance had embarrassed their Dominion's expeditionary force. I counted them carefully. 614 vessels, ranging from cruiser class to 3 additional dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the original fleet. Their arrival meant that the Vedrathi now had over 1,500 warships in our solar system. Against that, humanity had exactly 0 ships in orbit, a handful of nuclear-armed mining drones, and the battered remains of a defense infrastructure that had been designed to protect against asteroids. At least, that was what the Vedrathi believed. "Commander Kessler," the voice from Black Ridge said, and this time there was no calm. There was fire. "Phase 2 is active. Transfer your command to the vessel that will dock with Iron Veil in approximately 9 minutes. You are being reassigned." "What vessel? There are no human vessels in orbit." "There are now." It came around the curve of the moon like a predator sliding out of deep water. Dark-hulled, angular, built with an aggressive geometry that had nothing in common with any spacecraft I had ever seen in my career. It was maybe 300 meters long, tiny compared to the Vedrathi dreadnoughts, but something about its profile radiated menace, the way a blade radiates sharpness. Its hull was coated in a material that seemed to absorb the light around it, making the ship look less like an object and more like a hole cut in the stars. The name painted on its bow in plain white letters was Carrion Spike. "Greg," I said, "transfer all sensor data to external relay and prepare to abandon station." "We're leaving Iron Veil?" We just got promoted. I crossed from Iron Veil to the carrion spike through a docking umbilical that sealed with a pressure tolerance I had never encountered in human engineering. The interior of the ship was cramped, efficient, and smelled like ozone and fresh metal. The crew was already at battle stations. 31 people, most of them wearing uniforms I didn't recognize from any branch of any military I knew. They nodded at me as I moved through the corridors. No salutes, no ceremony. These were people who had been waiting for this day, and the waiting was over. The bridge was small. 5 stations, tight angles, every surface covered in displays showing tactical data that refreshed faster than I could track. The captain was a woman named Patricia Cole, lean and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had commanded warships before, even though, as far as the public record was concerned, humanity had no warships to command. Commander Kessler, welcome aboard. You're my new tactical officer. Your sensor expertise is why you're here. We can see the enemy, but you can see them better than anyone alive. How many ships do we have? 47. Stealth destroyers, hunter-killers, and drone carriers. Every combat vessel humanity has ever built. All in one place. All for the first time. 47 ships against 1,500. I should have felt despair. Instead, I felt the iron in my chest hum like a tuning fork. 47 ships that the Vedrathi couldn't see, crewed by a species that had spent 17 years learning how to kill things bigger than itself. What's the plan? Captain Cole smiled. It was not a warm smile. We let them come to us. Then we show them why you don't invade a death world. The Battle of the Lunar Corridor began at 1400 hours, and it was unlike any engagement in the history of warfare, human or otherwise. Our 47 ships moved in 3 waves. The first wave was composed entirely of drone carriers, unmanned vessels packed with autonomous combat platforms that could operate independently once deployed. They positioned themselves in the debris field created by the destruction of Redoubt 7, hiding among the wreckage of our own dead station, using the twisted metal and expanding gas clouds as cover. The second wave, which included the carrion spike, took position behind the moon, using the same lunar shadow that had protected me for 11 days. We were the strike element. Our job was to hit hard and fast once the enemy was committed. The third wave was something I had never imagined humanity capable of building. 22 missiles, each one the size of a small building, each one carrying a warhead that didn't use nuclear fission or fusion. When I asked Captain Cole what they were, she told me they were gravity lances, weapons that created a localized gravitational anomaly, powerful enough to crush a starship's hull like an aluminum can. The physics behind them had been theorized in the 2030s and perfected in secret over the following decade. No other species in the galaxy had them, because no other species had thought to weaponize gravity itself. The Vedrathi reinforcement fleet moved toward Earth in standard formation, confident and unhurried. They passed the moon's orbit and entered the corridor of space between the moon and Earth, a stretch of vacuum that humanity's tactical planners had spent years mapping, measuring, and preparing as a killing ground. The drone carriers activated first. 300 autonomous combat platforms erupted from the debris field and swarmed the leading edge of the Vedrathi formation. They were small, fast, and cheap, designed not to destroy enemy ships but to overwhelm their point defense systems and force them to break formation. The Vedrathi responded exactly as our planners had predicted. They concentrated their defensive fire on the drone swarm, pulling their formation tighter to create overlapping fields of fire. That was when the gravity lances fired. I felt nothing when they activated. There was no sound, no flash, no dramatic visual effect, but on my tactical display, I watched 22 points in space suddenly become something else. The gravitational anomalies expanded to their designed radius and caught the tightly packed Vedrathi formation in overlapping fields of force that no hull was designed to withstand. Ships crumpled. 38 Vedrathi vessels were destroyed in the first 4 seconds, their structures collapsing inward as the gravity lances created tidal forces that exceeded the tensile strength of their armor. The Vedrathi formation shattered, ships scattered in every direction, breaking away from the kill zone in desperate evasion maneuvers. And that was when the second wave hit. All hands, weapons free. Captain Cole said, and the carrion spike surged forward. Our stealth coating held. The Vedrathi sensors couldn't find us even as we closed to engagement range. I sat at my tactical station and painted targets, while the carrion spike's weapons officer fired kinetic rounds at velocities that turned simple metal slugs into instruments of devastation. We hit a Vedrathi cruiser amidships, and the round went clean through it, entering the port side and exiting the starboard side without slowing down, leaving a wound that tore the ship in half. Across the corridor, our other stealth destroyers were doing the same thing, invisible, silent, striking from angles the Vedrathi couldn't predict because they couldn't detect us. Their fleet was designed to fight enemies they could see, in formations that allowed for coordinated response. They had no doctrine for fighting ghosts. The battle lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, the Vedrathi lost over 200 ships. We lost 9. Each one of those 9 losses was a wound I felt personally, because at 47 total vessels, every ship was irreplaceable. But the exchange rate was devastating. For every human ship destroyed, the Vedrathi lost more than 20. I knew the names of the ships we lost. The Blackthorn, caught by a lucky salvo while repositioning after its stealth coating was damaged. The Pale Horse, which sacrificed itself to shield the drone carrier when a Vedrathi destroyer got a sensor lock on the carrier's position. The Resolution, the Cold Harbor, the Ember. 3 hunter-killers that were swarmed by a Vedrathi escort group that finally adapted to our tactics and began firing in saturation patterns designed to fill entire volumes of space with ordnance. You couldn't dodge what you couldn't fit between. 4 more followed in the final hour as the battle compressed into close-range exchanges where stealth mattered less and tonnage mattered more. Captain Cole tracked every loss on a display she kept on the corner of her console. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. When the Pale Horse went dark, she said quietly, "Get their crew manifests to the records officer." Then she went back to fighting. That was the kind of commander she was, the kind who carried the weight without letting it slow her down. But the Vedrathi were the ones paying the real price. Their reinforcement fleet, which had arrived in our solar system with 614 vessels, was being systematically dismantled by a force that they still couldn't see clearly on their sensors. Their tactical doctrine was collapsing. They had been trained for fleet engagements, where you could see your enemy and calculate your fire solutions based on visible positions and predictable movements. They had never fought anything invisible. They had never faced weapons that worked on principles they didn't understand. And they had never, in the entire history of their civilization, encountered an adversary that showed no signs of breaking, no matter how many losses it absorbed. On Earth's surface, the ground war was turning even more decisively. During the 11 days between the first counterattack and the reinforcement fleet's arrival, human scientists had done something that would later be described by a Galactic Council military analyst as the single most terrifying act of applied biology in recorded history. They had reverse-engineered Vedrathi physiology from tissue samples recovered from crashed landing craft. In 11 days, working in underground laboratories while their cities burned above them, human biologists had mapped the Vedrathi respiratory system, identified its vulnerabilities, and developed targeted chemical agents that attacked those vulnerabilities specifically. The agents were harmless to humans, harmless to terrestrial animals, harmless to every form of life on Earth. But to the Vedrathi, they were lethal. The agents were deployed through atmospheric dispersal systems that had been built into human cities as part of emergency air quality infrastructure. The Vedrathi ground forces began dying inside their own armor. They couldn't breathe. The air that humans walked through without concern was killing them with every inhalation, and they couldn't figure out why, because the agents were engineered to be undetectable by Vedrathi sensor equipment. Their field medics had no diagnosis. Their commanders had no countermeasure. Vedrathi soldiers who had been confidently patrolling occupied cities 12 hours earlier were now collapsing in the streets, and the humans who stepped over them on the way to the counterattack didn't even glance down. The speed of this development was what truly shook the galactic community. Biological warfare was not new. Several council species had developed it over the course of centuries, but those species had years of study, captured specimens, controlled laboratory conditions, and institutional knowledge accumulated over generations. Humanity had tissue samples from crashed vehicles, makeshift labs under bombed-out cities, and 11 days. The gap between what should have been possible and what humanity actually accomplished forced every species watching to recalculate their assumptions about what humans could do when sufficiently motivated. The reports I intercepted from the Galactic Council were no longer calm. Multiple species were demanding to know how a pre-contact primitive had developed targeted biological weapons in less than 2 weeks. The Vanteri delegation, a species that prided itself on its own biological research, publicly stated that the development timeline was impossible and accused the Lorathi of having secretly provided humans with advanced technology. The Lorathi ambassador denied it with a fury that left no room for doubt. Humanity had done this alone. That was precisely what made it terrifying. The Lorathi observer, whose earlier warnings had been ignored, submitted a formal motion to reclassify humanity from a pre-contact species to an existential threat. The motion was put to a vote. It failed, not because any council member disagreed with the classification, but because passing it would have required acknowledging that the council had allowed a species capable of this level of adaptive response to be attacked without warning or intervention. The council's cowardice had become self-reinforcing. They couldn't admit what humanity was without admitting what they had allowed to happen to us. I intercepted private diplomatic communications during this period that painted an even more unsettling picture of the council's state of mind. Several species had begun running projections, mathematical models attempting to calculate humanity's technological trajectory based on the rate of advancement we had demonstrated in the past 2 weeks. The models kept returning results that the analysts flagged as errors because the growth curves they produced were steeper than anything in the galactic database. One analyst, whose species I couldn't identify from the communication headers, wrote a single line that I saved because it captured the essence of the galaxy's dawning comprehension. He wrote that the Council was not watching a species defend its homeworld. It was watching a species undergo a metamorphosis triggered by trauma, and the organism that emerged on the other side would be something the galaxy had never encountered. The Vidrathi flagship was the last major target of the battle. It was their largest vessel, a dreadnought over 2 kilometers long, and it had positioned itself at the rear of the formation, protected by a screen of escort ships. Captain Cole ordered the carrion Spike to close range. We came in alone, running silent, our stealth coating absorbing every sensor pulse the Vidrathi threw at the space around them. I guided us through a gap in their escort screen that I identified using Iron Veil's sensor data, still streaming from the platform I had abandoned. We passed within 300 meters of a Vidrathi cruiser, close enough that I could see the individual hull plates through the viewport, and they never knew we were there. The flagship filled our forward view. 2 kilometers of alien warship, bristling with weapons, wrapped in armor that was supposed to be impervious to anything a primitive species could throw at it. I locked my targeting solution onto the reactor section, where the hull was thinnest, because the Vidrathi designers had never imagined an enemy getting close enough to exploit that weakness. 2 rounds, Captain Cole said. Make them count. I fired. 2 kinetic rounds, moving at 4% of light speed, crossed the distance between us and the flagship in less than a heartbeat. They hit the reactor section and punched through the armor like it was cloth. The flagship's reactor containment failed. The ship didn't explode. It broke. A crack appeared along its spine, running from bow to stern, and the 2 halves separated in a slow, grinding movement that scattered hull fragments and atmosphere and bodies into the void. The radiation from the reactor breach washed over us. I felt the carrion Spike shudder as our hull absorbed the energy, and damage alarms lit up across the bridge. But we were alive, and the Vidrathi flagship was dead. Captain Cole opened a broad-spectrum communication channel. Every frequency the galaxy used, from the Vidrathi military bands to the Galactic Council's diplomatic channels. She looked at me, and I understood. She wanted me to say it. I leaned into the microphone and spoke in Galactic Common, the language that humanity had learned in secret from 17 years of intercepted alien transmissions, the language we were never supposed to know. My voice was steady. My words were simple. Tell your masters we are coming. The Vidrathi fleet broke, not in an orderly retreat, not in a tactical withdrawal, but in a rout. Ships that had been holding formation turned and ran for the slip space boundary, abandoning their ground forces, abandoning their occupation zones, abandoning every pretense that they were in control of this situation. In the 4,000-year military history of the Vedrathi Dominion, no expeditionary force had ever retreated from a battlefield. Their military culture was built on the assumption that superior numbers and superior technology guaranteed victory against any lesser species. They had never needed a contingency plan for losing, because losing had never been considered a possibility worth planning for. Now they were learning. Every officer on every surviving Vedrathi ship was learning the same lesson at the same time, a lesson that would reshape galactic military doctrine for centuries. Numbers don't matter when you can't find your enemy. Technology doesn't matter when your enemy builds weapons you've never imagined. And superiority doesn't matter at all when your enemy refuses to acknowledge it. I watched them run, through the viewport of a ship that shouldn't exist, built by a species they had tried to erase. I watched the most powerful military force in the galaxy flee from the survivors of their own massacre. Some of their ships didn't make it. The Carrion Spike and our surviving stealth destroyers pursued the retreating fleet to the slipspace boundary, picking off damaged vessels that couldn't maintain full speed. We didn't need to. They were already beaten. But we did it anyway, because we wanted them to carry the memory of being hunted all the way home. We wanted every officer who survived this day to spend the rest of their career remembering what it felt like to run from a species they had dismissed as insignificant. In the Galactic Council chamber, which I could still monitor through our intercepted feeds, there was silence. 300 species, watching sensor data that showed a Vedrathi armada in full retreat from a planet they had bombed into ruin less than 2 weeks ago. The Lorathi observer spoke into that silence, and her words were transmitted to every diplomatic channel in the galaxy. What have they done? What have we allowed to wake up? Nobody answered her. Nobody could. The funerals hadn't started yet. There were too many dead to count, and the counting itself was an act that would take months, maybe years. 341 million people. That was the preliminary estimate, and everyone knew the final number would be higher. 341 million human beings who had been alive 2 weeks ago, who had eaten breakfast and gone to work and kissed their children, and never imagined that the sky would open up and burn everything they loved to ash. I didn't go to the memorial services that were already beginning in the underground shelters. I didn't have time. 24 hours after the Vedrathi fleet retreated from Earth orbit, I received orders for Phase 3 of Protocol Lazarus, and Phase 3 was not defensive. The briefing was held aboard the Carrion Spike, in a compartment that was too small for the number of officers crammed into it. Captain Cole stood at the front, with a holographic display showing a star system I didn't recognize. The room was silent, except for the hum of the ship's life support systems and the occasional creak of the hull cooling after battle damage. "This is the Korath system," Cole said. "It is the Vedrathi Dominion's primary forward staging base for operations in this sector of the galaxy. Every ship that attacked Earth was deployed from this facility. Every order that authorized our extermination was transmitted through this station." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "We are going there. We are going to take it." The silence in the room was absolute. "Captain," said a voice from the back. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Ross, who ran the weapons systems on one of our surviving hunter-killers. "We have 22 combat-capable ships, and 1 carrier. We're going to attack a Vedrathi military installation with 22 ships? 22 ships and a carrier full of combat drones that have already proven they can overwhelm Vedrathi point defense. Plus something new." She tapped the display, and the image shifted to show a schematic of a drive system I didn't recognize. "This is a slipspace drive. Our engineering teams reverse-engineered it from captured Vedrathi equipment." "How long did that take?" 11 days. The room went quiet again. I understood the silence. The Vedrathi had developed slipspace technology over 8 centuries. Our engineers had figured it out in less than 2 weeks, working in underground labs while their world burned above them. That fact would later cause 3 separate diplomatic incidents when it reached the Galactic Council, because it forced every species in the galaxy to confront a question they didn't want to ask. Was humanity a natural species, or something else entirely? We departed Earth 48 hours later, 22 warships, and the carrier Swift Resolve, carrying a complement of 300 combat drones and a crew of just over 1,000 people. We were the first human beings to leave our solar system under our own power. The moment should have felt historic. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like what it was, a wounded species baring its teeth and going hunting. The slip-space jump was disorienting. Reality folded around us like paper being crumpled, and for a fraction of a second, that felt like an eternity. I existed in a space that had no dimensions, no direction, no time. Then we were through, and the stars outside our viewport were different. The Korath system spread before us on the tactical display, a dim red star, 3 gas giants, and orbiting the second gas giant, the Vidrathi forward staging base. It was enormous. A structure that had been operational for 600 years, expanded and reinforced over centuries, until it was less a station and more a small moon, made of metal and weapons. Docked at its exterior were over 50 Vidrathi warships in various states of readiness, along with hundreds of support vessels and transports. We had traveled 8 light-years from home. The crew of the Carrion Spike was silent at their stations, looking at alien stars through alien space, preparing to attack a fortress that a species 100 times our age had spent centuries building. All ships, this is the flagship, Captain Cole broadcast to the task force. We exit slipspace in attack formation. We do not announce ourselves. We do not issue warnings. We do not wait. We hit them before they know we're here, and we don't stop hitting them until the station is ours. You know what they did to our world. You know what they did to our people. Today, we show them the cost. We dropped out of slipspace already firing. The Vidrathi had defense systems. They had patrol ships. They had early warning sensors that should have given them minutes of advance notice. None of it mattered. We emerged from slipspace inside their defensive perimeter, bypassing every outer layer of protection, because our engineers had calculated our exit point with a precision that the Vidrathi considered theoretically impossible. You don't emerge from slipspace close to a gravity well. Everyone in the galaxy knew that. Everyone except the humans, who had looked at the equations, disagreed, and then proved they were right by doing it. The first 90 seconds were chaos. Our hunter-killers spread out and engaged the docked warships before they could power up their weapons. Kinetic rounds tore through vessels that were still connected to refueling umbilicals, and the detonation of their fuel stores added to the devastation. The drone swarm launched from swift resolve and descended on the station's defensive batteries, swarming them the way insects swarm a predator, too many to track, too fast to stop. I targeted the station's communication array first. We could not allow them to call for help. 2 kinetic rounds severed the primary transmitter array from the station's hull, and a follow-up salvo from our wingman destroyed the secondary array. The Vidrathi base was now deaf and mute, cut off from the Dominion, alone with us. The exterior battle lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, every Vidrathi warship at the station was destroyed or disabled, and the station's defensive capabilities had been reduced to scattered point defense batteries that our drones were systematically eliminating. Then came the boarding action. I had never been trained for close-quarters combat. I was a sensor operator, a targeting specialist, a woman who fought her wars through screens and data feeds. But Protocol Lazarus didn't care about your specialty. When the order came to board the station, every able body with a weapon was part of the assault team. The corridors of the Vidrathi station were built for beings that stood 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The ceilings loomed above us, the doorways yawned open like cave mouths, and every surface was covered in alien script that we couldn't read and controls we didn't understand. We moved through those corridors in 4-person fire teams, clearing rooms, securing junctions, pushing deeper into the station's interior. The gravity aboard the station was lighter than Earth standard, which gave us an unexpected advantage. Our muscles, built for a heavier world, propelled us faster and farther than the Vidrathi expected. We could jump obstacles they had to climb over. We could move through their low-clearance maintenance passages that their larger bodies couldn't fit into. We used those passages as flanking routes, appearing behind defensive positions that the Vidrathi thought were secure, turning their knowledge of their own station against them. The Vidrathi defenders fought us in those corridors. They were bigger, stronger, and they knew the layout of their own station, but they had never fought humans before. Not face-to-face, not in the tight confines of an interior space. They didn't understand how we moved. They didn't understand our endurance, the way a human can keep fighting at sustained intensity for hours, when most species in the galaxy exhaust themselves in minutes. They didn't understand our coordination, the way a fire team of 4 humans operates as a single organism, each member anticipating the other's actions without verbal communication. And they didn't understand our adaptability, the way a human soldier who encounters an unexpected obstacle will improvise a solution in seconds, using whatever is at hand, without waiting for orders or consulting a manual. A Vidrathi officer who survived the boarding would later testify before the Galactic Council. His testimony was translated and distributed to every member species. He said that the humans didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like something that had lost everything it loved and wanted the universe to feel the same wound. We took the station in 6 hours. The cost was high. We lost 78 people, nearly 8% of our total force, and every one of those losses was someone I had shared a ship with, eaten meals with, stood beside in the brief moments of quiet between battles. Their names were recorded, memorized, carried forward. Humans don't forget. The station, once secured, was a treasure trove of intelligence that went far beyond military significance. The data cores held centuries of Vidrathi records, including detailed files on every species in the galaxy, threat assessments for civilizations the Council didn't even know existed, and something that made my blood run cold when our analysts translated it. A list, a formal registry of species, the Vidrathi Dominion intended to pacify over the next century, ranked by resource value and estimated resistance capability. Earth had been number 47 on that list. The Vidrathi hadn't singled us out. They hadn't even thought about us long enough to single us out. We were just the next item on a schedule of planned extinctions, slotted between a methane-breathing civilization in the Orton Nebula and an aquatic species whose homeworld contained mineral deposits the Dominion wanted. I read through that list and counted the entries. 112 species, 112 civilizations that the Vidrathi intended to destroy, one by one, over the coming decades. And the Galactic Council, whose stated purpose was to preserve interspecies peace, had those same Vidrathi sitting in honored chairs in their assembly chamber. We transmitted the list to Earth immediately. Within hours, it had been forwarded to the Galactic Council through channels that humanity was not supposed to have access to. The reaction was immediate and convulsive. Species on that list were suddenly very interested in what had happened at Earth. Species not on the list were suddenly very interested in making sure they stayed off it. The political landscape of the galaxy shifted beneath the Council's feet, and the Vidrathi ambassador found himself surrounded by colleagues who were no longer looking at humanity's actions with disapproval. They were looking at the Vidrathi with something much more dangerous than anger. They were looking at them with the clear-eyed calculation of species that had just learned they might be next. While we secured the station, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The Vidrathi ambassador, the same one who had casually notified the Council of our pacification 2 weeks earlier, stood before the assembly and demanded intervention. The species that had launched an unprovoked assault on a planet of 8 billion people, that had killed hundreds of millions of civilians in a bombardment that lasted 90 minutes, was now asking the galaxy to protect it from the consequences. The irony was visible on every face in the chamber, even the alien ones. Council members who had said nothing while Earth burned now expressed deep concern about human aggression. They talked about proportionality, about the rules of engagement that governed civilized warfare, about the importance of de-escalation in interspecies conflict. They said these things without any visible awareness that they had watched a genocide unfold and done nothing to stop it. The Lorathi ambassador stood. She was the one who had warned the Council from the beginning, whose recommendations had been ignored, whose formal motion to reclassify humanity had been voted down. She looked around the chamber at her colleagues, at the representatives of 300 species who had the power to intervene and chose comfort over conscience, and she said one sentence: "We watched 200 million humans die and said nothing. We do not get to be afraid of the survivors." The chamber fell silent. It stayed silent for a long time. I didn't hear her words in real time. I was busy overseeing the capture of the Vidrathi station's data cores, which contained operational records going back centuries. But when the transcript reached me, hours later, I read that sentence 3 times and felt something loosen in my chest. Somewhere out there, in the vast machinery of galactic civilization, someone had the courage to say what was true. Back on Earth, the intelligence teams were already processing the data we transmitted from the captured station. The Vidrathi operational records confirmed what we had suspected. The assault on Earth had not been a military necessity. It had not been a defensive action. It had been a territorial acquisition, planned and approved by the Vidrathi Military Council as a routine operation to claim a resource-rich planet from a species too primitive to resist. They had killed 300 million people for real estate. I stood on the observation deck of the captured station, looking out at stars I was seeing for the first time with my own eyes, and I understood something about the path my species was on. We had been attacked without provocation, ignored in our suffering, and left to die by a galaxy that considered us beneath notice. And we had survived. Not just survived, but crossed the stars, fought an enemy in its own territory, and won. The question now was what we would do with that survival. The answer was already being broadcast. While I stood on that observation deck, humanity's communication team was using the station's repaired transmitter to send a message on every frequency the galaxy used, translated into 400 languages by teams that had been studying alien linguistics in secret for almost 2 decades. The message was simple. We know you watched. We know you did nothing. We are coming to the council chambers. Not to attack, not to threaten, to sit in the chair you never offered us. And you will make room. I watched the message propagate outward at the speed of light, carrying the voice of a species that the galaxy had tried to ignore into silence. 341 million dead, and we were still talking, still standing, still coming. Let them hear us. I had never owned a dress uniform. Orbital defense coordinators don't attend diplomatic functions. We work in maintenance jumpsuits and console chairs, surrounded by screens and recycled air. And the closest we get to ceremony is the annual systems certification inspection, where someone from headquarters checks our equipment logs and leaves without making eye contact. But when the orders came down to form the delegation that would travel to the Galactic Council capital, my name was on the list. I was told to report to the quartermasters on swift resolve for a fitting. When I arrived, they handed me a uniform I had never seen before. Black, pressed sharp enough to cut, with a patch on the right shoulder showing Earth against a field of stars, and underneath it, new words in new letters, Earth Expeditionary Force. I put it on and looked at myself in the metal mirror bolted to the bulkhead wall. The woman looking back at me was not the same person who had been calibrating satellites 3 weeks ago. She was thinner, harder, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not anger, certainty. We departed the Korath system with 12 warships in escort formation around the diplomatic vessel. The ship carrying the delegation was the Quiet Meridian, a fast transport that had been built in the hidden shipyards of the asteroid belt and had never been intended for diplomacy. Its original purpose was intelligence gathering. Its hull was packed with sensor equipment, signal intercept arrays, and electronic warfare systems that could have disrupted communications across an entire star system. For this mission, most of those systems had been powered down. Most, but not all. The journey to the council capital took 3 days through slipspace. I spent those 3 days reviewing everything we knew about the council, its member species, its protocols, its history. I studied the layout of the council chamber. I memorized the names and positions of every ambassador. I learned which species had spoken against the Vidrathi attack, which had remained silent, and which had privately expressed support. The list of silent ones was long. The list of supportive ones was mercifully short but not empty, and those names were filed away for future reference. The head of our delegation was a woman named Lian Pham. Before the attack, she had been a crisis negotiator for the United Nations, specializing in humanitarian emergencies in conflict zones. She had spent 20 years talking warlords and dictators into releasing hostages, opening aid corridors, and agreeing to ceasefires. She was the best negotiator our species had, and we needed the best, because what she was about to do had never been attempted in the history of the galaxy. She was also the survivor of the Mumbai bombardment. She had been in the city when the first volley hit, attending a diplomatic conference on global water rights. She had been pulled from the rubble of her hotel 16 hours later by rescue workers who had dug through 9 floors of collapsed concrete to reach her. Her husband and 2 daughters had been in a different part of the city. They were not pulled from anything. They were among the 341 million. I met her on the second day of the journey, in the small observation lounge aboard the Quiet Meridian. She was standing at the viewport, watching the strange light of slipspace shift and pulse outside the hull. She was smaller than I expected. Quiet, her hands were steady. "Commander Kessler," she said without turning around. "You were on Iron Veil when it started." "Yes, ma'am." "You watched the bombardment from orbit." "Yes." She turned then, and I saw her eyes. They were dry, clear. There was a depth to them that I recognized, because I had seen it in my own mirror. The depth of someone who has seen the worst thing imaginable and decided to keep functioning, not because the pain is gone, but because there is work to do. "Good," she said. "I need someone on the delegation who saw it happen. When I speak to the council, I want them to see us, not just hear our words, see what we survived." The Galactic Council capital was called Nexus Prime. It was a station, but calling it that was like calling an ocean a pond. The structure orbited a neutron star at the center of a carefully maintained zone of neutral space, and it was old. Older than most of the civilizations that sat on it. It had been built by a species that no longer existed, expanded by 100 successor species over millennia, and it now housed the administrative, diplomatic, and judicial apparatus of a galactic community that spanned 300 member species and over 40,000 inhabited worlds. We arrived at the outer approach corridor with our 12-ship escort, and I watched through the viewport as Nexus Prime grew from a point of light to a structure that filled the entire forward view. It was beautiful, sweeping arcs of metal and crystal, illuminated by the cold light of the neutron star, housing millions of beings who had built a civilization that stretched across the galaxy. It was everything humanity had dreamed of when we first looked up at the stars and imagined we weren't alone. And not one of those millions had lifted a finger when our world was burning. We docked at a berth that had been hastily prepared for a species whose physical dimensions weren't in the station's database. The air pressure was wrong, the gravity was slightly off, and the lighting was tuned for visual spectrums that weren't quite human. Small discomforts, reminders that this place was not built for us, had never expected us, and was not entirely happy that we were here. The delegation walked from the docking bay to the council chamber through corridors that were filled with beings I had never seen before. Hundreds of species, varying in size from things smaller than my hand to creatures that had to duck through doorways built for the galactic average. They watched us pass, every single one of them watched, and the expression on their alien faces, however different their anatomy, was recognizable across every biological boundary. Fear. They were afraid of us. Not of our weapons, not of our warships, not of the military capability we had demonstrated in the past 3 weeks. They were afraid of us the way you fear something that breaks the rules you thought were fundamental. Every model, every theory, every historical precedent in the galaxy said that a species hit as hard as we had been hit, should have collapsed, should have surrendered, should have died. We did none of those things. We took the worst blow any civilization had ever survived and turned it into fuel, and the galaxy didn't have a category for what that made us. The council chamber was a vast circular space, tiered like an amphitheater, with seating for representatives of every member species arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking platform. The chamber was full. Not just ambassadors, but observers, analysts, military liaisons, media recorders from dozens of species. The entire galaxy was watching. Lian Pham walked to the central platform. She was alone. Protocol dictated that she could bring advisors, but she refused. She wanted the council to see one human, standing by herself, representing a species that had almost been erased from the galaxy. The image mattered. Everything about this moment mattered. I stood with the rest of the delegation in an observation gallery above the chamber floor, close enough to see the faces of the ambassadors, close enough to hear every word through the translation systems built into the gallery's walls. I watched Lian Pham take her position at the speaker's podium, a device that hadn't been calibrated for human vocal frequencies, and had to be adjusted on the spot by a nervous council technician. She waited until the chamber was completely silent. She was good at silence. 20 years of crisis negotiation had taught her that silence was a weapon as effective as any gun, because it forced everyone in the room to sit with their own thoughts, their own guilt, their own fear. When she spoke, her voice was calm, not cold, not angry. Calm. The calm of a woman who had decided exactly what she was going to say, and was going to say it, regardless of how the galaxy responded. She did not rage. She did not threaten. She did not demand. She simply told them what had happened. She told them about the first volley, the coordinated bombardment that had struck 12 major cities simultaneously. She told them about Mumbai, where she had been staying with her family, where 17 million people had lived and worked and raised their children, in a city that was older than most of the civilizations sitting in this chamber. She told them about Lagos, about Sao Paulo, about the cities that burned while the council watched and did nothing. She named the cities. She named the hospitals that had been hit. She named schools. She named a park in Mumbai where her daughters used to play on Saturday mornings, a park that was now a crater filled with radioactive glass. She told them the number, 341 million dead. She said it once, clearly, and then she paused and let the number sit in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. 341 million people who would never come home, and not one voice in this chamber had spoken to stop it. Then she asked her question. One question, delivered in a voice that carried to every corner of that ancient room. Which of you would have spoken if we had died quietly? Nobody answered. The chamber was so silent that I could hear the hum of the translation systems, processing the question into 400 languages, delivering it to every ear in the room. 300 species, thousands of years of civilization, trillions of beings across 40,000 worlds, and not one of them could answer the question of a woman who had lost everything and crossed the stars to ask it. The silence lasted for what felt like hours. I watched faces. Alien faces, strange and unfamiliar, but I could read them. Shame. I could read shame across every biological boundary, because shame is universal. It looks the same in every pair of eyes, no matter how many eyes there are. When Lian Pham spoke again, she shifted to the matter of consequence. The Vedrathi Dominion. The Council had already begun drafting a sanctions package, the harshest in galactic history, designed to punish the Vedrathi for their unprovoked aggression, economic isolation, military restrictions, diplomatic censure. It was comprehensive, and it was entirely inadequate. Lian Pham rejected it, not angrily. Patiently, the way a teacher corrects a well-meaning student. Sanctions, she explained, were what you imposed on a species that had violated a trade agreement or breached a territorial boundary. The Vedrathi had committed something beyond the scope of sanctions. They had attempted to destroy an entire species. The word for that was not a trade violation. The word for that existed in the legal systems of every civilization in the galaxy, and it demanded a different kind of response. She demanded the extradition of the Vedrathi military leadership to stand trial on Earth, under human law, in human courts, for crimes against the human species. The chamber erupted. No species had ever been subjected to another species' legal system. The precedent was unthinkable. It undermined the sovereignty principles that the entire council was built on. Lian Pham waited for the noise to subside, and then she said the thing that ended the debate. She said that no species in the history of the galaxy had ever committed what the Vedrathi committed, while the rest of civilization watched in comfort. If the council wanted to talk about precedent, she said, let them start with that one. The vote was unanimous. Even the Vedrathi delegation voted in favor, because the alternative, Lian Pham explained with perfect calm, was that humanity would come and collect them. And humanity had already demonstrated its willingness to cross the stars to settle its debts. After the session, I stood in the observation gallery of Nexus Prime and looked down at a planet I didn't know, orbiting a star I couldn't name. The light of the neutron star cast everything in a pale blue glow that made the station's surfaces look like ice. Around me, the station hummed with the activity of a civilization that had existed for millennia, that had built wonders and explored mysteries, and created a community of intelligent life that spanned the galaxy. And none of it had saved us. None of it had even tried. I thought about what humanity had become in 3 weeks. Not conquerors, not victims, something the galaxy had no word for, a species that had been nearly destroyed and responded not just with survival, but with a refusal to ever be in that position again. Earth was already rebuilding. I had seen the reports, the construction crews working around the clock, the factories spinning up, the shipyards expanding from hidden facilities into full public operation. Every child born on Earth from this day forward would grow up knowing that the stars were full of life, and that none of that life had come to help. Lian Pham found me in the gallery. She stood beside me and looked out at the same alien sky, and for a long time neither of us spoke. "Do you think they'll change?" I asked eventually. "The Council. Do you think any of this will make them different?" She considered the question with the same care she brought to everything. "I think they'll remember," she said. "Whether that makes them different depends on whether memory is enough. For most species, it seems to be. They remember, and they adjust, and they find ways to rationalize what they did or didn't do." She paused. "Humans are different. We don't just remember. We build. We build walls and weapons and ships and monuments and laws, and we stack them up until the thing that hurt us can never reach us again. It's not rational. It's not proportional. It's not what the Council would call civilized behavior, but it's why we're standing here instead of buried under the rubble of our own world." I didn't have a response to that. She didn't need one. I returned to Earth aboard the Carrion Spike. Captain Cole offered me a permanent posting on her crew, a commission in the Expeditionary Force, a place among the people who would carry humanity's presence into the galaxy. I told her I would think about it. I meant it. But first, I needed to go home. I asked Cole for a flyover before landing. She understood without my having to explain. The Carrion Spike descended through the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean, and I pressed my face to the viewport as the coastline came into view. Mumbai, or what had been Mumbai. The crater was enormous, visible from altitude as a dark wound in the green and brown of the landscape. But around the edges of the crater, stretching outward in every direction, there was movement. Cranes, scaffolding, the angular shapes of new foundations being poured. Millions of people, working in the dust and heat, building on top of ashes. And beside the construction, untouched and carefully maintained, a memorial field that stretched to the horizon. White markers, rows and rows and rows of them. More than I could count. More than anyone could count from this altitude. Each one a name, each one a person, each one a life that had been taken by beings who considered us beneath consideration, watched by a galaxy that considered us beneath concern. I pressed my hand against the viewport. The glass was cold against my palm. Below me, the white markers stood in perfect rows, and the construction cranes swung their loads, and the people moved and built and mourned, and refused, absolutely refused, to lie down and be forgotten. No one would ever touch this world again, not because the Galactic Council had learned its lesson, not because the Vidrathi Dominion had been punished, not because the rules of galactic civilization would protect us. Nobody would ever touch this world again, because we would not allow the galaxy to be in a position where its protection mattered. We would stand on our own, as we had always stood, alone and stubborn and furious and alive. The Carrion Spike landed on scorched ground that was already growing new grass. I walked down the ramp and felt Earth's gravity settle onto my shoulders, like an old friend's hand. The air smelled like dust and rain, and something green pushing up through the wreckage. Above me, the sky was full of contrails, human ships, coming and going, climbing and descending, a species that had spent 10,000 years looking up at the stars and wondering if they were alone. We were not alone. We wished we were. But since we were not, we would make sure the galaxy remembered what it cost to make enemies of the species that grew up on a world that tried to kill them every single day, through earthquake and flood and fire and ice, through extinction events and ice ages and plagues and predators, and survived it all, every single time, not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, but because we were the ones who simply refused to stop. Let the galaxy remember that. Let them remember Mumbai and Lagos and Sao Paulo. Let them remember the 341 million. Let them remember the silence of their own chamber when the fires fell. and let them remember what crawled out of the ashes.